Hello and welcome to Unconscious Bias Training. My name is Sarah Dickinson-Hyams. For the past 7 years, I have worked for the Equality Challenge Unit in the UK, and I have run the Athena Swan and Race Equality Charters. These are award schemes which higher education and research institutes apply for, and the way they apply for these awards is through an application process. And these applications are peer-reviewed in a similar way to the Fellowship of the Academy. I've also been, for the last 4 years, working with the Academy and their Science Australia Gender Equity Programme, supporting them to run the Athena Swan Charter in Australia. This has included training the panellists for the peer review process. So this training today is devised from the training given to both the UK Athena Swan assessment panellists as well as the Australian ones. So to start with, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what unconscious bias is, and then I'll be looking at what we can do to change and challenge biases, and I will look at 3 solutions to challenging bias: association, awareness, and accountability. But first, to look at what unconscious bias is. So our unconscious thoughts and interpretations happen much quicker than our conscious ones. The brain works fast, and sometimes it works too fast, making assumptions on our behalf. Unconscious biases, also known as implicit or subconscious biases, happen automatically and are triggered by our brains making quick judgments and assessments of people and situations. And this is influenced by our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences. They have the potential to influence our behaviour and decision-making and to prompt us to act in ways that are not objective, fair, or based on rational evidence. Whilst we remain unaware of our unconscious biases, we're not able to take action to manage their impact. And so in order to enable transparent and fair discussions and recommendations, as well as good governance during sectional committees, each committee member has a responsibility to recognise and acknowledge their own personal biases and find ways to mitigate their impact on behaviour and decision making. Developing the ability to identify and understand biases is the first step towards ensuring that they do not lead us to act in ways that are unfair. So everyone has people preferences, and our brains are designed to instantly categorise people into in-groups or out-groups. We tend to like people who are like us, and often we assume that this is about demographic differences, such as gender or ethnicity, and these can be a trigger, but in science, in research, and in higher education fields, other facets of identity can be influential, such as the field of science someone works in or the institution that they're from. Status can also be important, so what grade or level someone is at, whether they're a fellow, etc. These sorts of factors can determine who you identify with. So we tend to see people in our in-groups as more likable, but we also see them as more competent and more trustworthy. So committee members may be more likely to be influenced by the opinions of those in their in-groups and more likely to demonstrate their agreement to their opinions, both verbally and non-verbally. For people in our out-groups, we can feel less warmth towards them and to see them as less competent. This can play out at work and in life with people not listening to or valuing the opinions of members in their out-group. If everyone is aware of this, you can all work together to act in ways that mitigate against these tendencies. But if they're unconscious, then it can lead to micro-inequities. So micro-inequities are small, subtle behaviours that signal that someone is less important. It affects who you attend to, whose opinions matter, and who you're happy to speak over, and things like that. In this way, unconscious bias can affect all of our interactions. And so I've just got a 5-minute video from Dr. Pete Jones, who's a chartered psychologist in the UK, and this should explain the science behind unconscious bias.
Psychologists have known for some time that we have two operating systems for processing information within the brain, working at the same time but doing very different things with the same information: the conscious and the unconscious. The conscious is part of our new brain, developed fairly recently. This is where most of the clever thinking goes on: problem solving, decision making. It is slow in operation, taking several seconds to process even basic information and to make decisions. It is very limited in processing power, just 8 bits of information at any one time, and it is driven by taught rules about how to do things and how to think. It relies on logically processing data. We believe that it is in control because in our lives we see all of the achievements of the conscious: technology, civil society, agriculture. The list goes on. The unconscious, on the other hand, is rarely seen working. It runs constantly and effortlessly in the background, handling all of our routine information processing, a sort of autopilot. Instead of being slow and data-driven, it is incredibly fact and intuitively driven. It is a processing method needed by our ancestors to make rapid survival decisions. Brain scan evidence shows it processes information in people in as little as 30 milliseconds, 10 times faster than our eyes can even process the person's face. It has much more processing power than the conscious, 200,000 times more. Psychologists say that what the brain fires together, it wires together. In other words, when it often sees two things occurring together, like women with children or women receptionists, it creates a strong neural connection in the brain, which it can use in the future. For example, when it sees women, it thinks children, and when it thinks children, it makes the connection to women. This is very convenient for the brain. It prevents it having to use the conscious to think about every new person or situation as unique. The brain makes these neural connections from the patterns we see in our lives, but also from the media we absorb and what the people we care about say, as well as our upbringing. Once wired, they are hard to unwire, and we can use them automatically and without knowing it. It is our caveman or cavewoman brain. Let me put things into perspective. If the processing power of the conscious was the size of a table tennis ball, the processing power of the unconscious is a table tennis ball 200,000 times larger, or 2.4 meters across. When the small conscious table tennis ball is busy or overwhelmed, which it often is, the unconscious takes over routine people decisions using its neural pathways based on previous patterns. The next bit is important. Our unconscious creates super fast connections between groups of people: old, young, black, white, with tattoos, wearing funny t-shirts, having a particular accent, from a particular area or country, educated at a particular school or university, and good or bad ideas the psychologists call constructs. These super fast links are used to make rapid people judgments below the level of our subconscious. The conscious thinks it is in control, but the unconscious calls the shots and leaves the conscious to believe it is in control by rationalizing decisions the unconscious has already made. These super fast people decisions are useful in making our lives run smoothly. Most of the time they are good enough, and our ancestors avoided the saber-toothed tiger or lion. But these days our people decisions result in real impacts on the lives of real people. Who gets the job? Who gets the most rewarding work? Who gets the best pay or bonus? And who gets promoted or fired? We tend to wire more positive connections for people who are like us, who look like us, sound like us, share our background, culture, and interests. That leaves people who are less like us not being treated as positively. Don't get me wrong, often these more positive wirings for people who are like us does not lead to obvious negative behavior towards people not like us. But they experience what the psychologists call micro-behaviors, small bits of behavior which, over time, make them feel less like they belong or are valued, like acid rain that wears you down over time. It leads to us recruiting and supporting people who are more like us. We don't do it on purpose. We don't have a tick list reminding us to give slightly better treatment to people like us, but our unconscious leads us to do that unless we are careful. The bottom line is that we trust people for whom we have unintentionally wired positive connections. We give them jobs, give them the best work, allocate them to our teams, and say the right things about them when it matters. This doesn't make us a bad person. It makes us human. But when we make important decisions about people, we need to take extra care. If you are now asking, what can I do about it? You should watch our animated session, where we offer some ideas, sometimes slightly weird ideas, on mitigating unconscious bias, or watch our whiteboard animation on recruiting and how unconscious bias drives our decisions about who we employ, you can contact Dr. Pete by email, phone, and by Twitter.
So, as I said at the beginning, we're now going to look at solutions to bias grouped into 3 overarching categories: association, awareness, and accountability. So these solutions are drawn either from a review of unconscious bias that was carried out by the Equality Challenge Unit in the UK, or from other relevant research from social psychology. So the first theme we're going to look at is association, and this is about giving our unconscious something different to associate with, rather than just the status quo or with negative associations. So increasing positive associations is a proven way to reduce bias, and there have been several studies around that. For example, in a study in 2001, Dasgupta and Greenwald found that pro-white implicit bias was reduced when participants in their study were given positive examples of Black people, for example, Denzel Washington, and infamous white examples such as Hitler. The study highlighted the importance for staff and students of seeing people in roles that they would not stereotypically be seen in. Further study by Dasgupta and Asghari found exposure to women leaders reduced women's gender stereotypical beliefs. And in a study by Aberson in 2004, participants with close friends who were Black or Latino exhibited less implicit prejudice than participants without close friends from these groups. And also in studies by Shook and Fazio in 2008 and Turner and Crisp in 2010 showed that implicit bias was reduced by both increasing levels of contact with out-group members, but also by having imagined contact with out-group members. And so there are other ways that you can look to increase positive associations. So increasing exposure to diverse groups and role models. And you can do this at your own organisations through interacting with events like International Women's Day and Black History Month, and just making sure that there's diversity included in publications and marketing materials and teaching materials at your own organisations. Also looking to see who the guest lecturers and speakers are at any events that you're running. So we're now going to look more closely at in-groups and out-groups. And I have another video to show you.
We're ready to dive into a conversation about a topic we're all really familiar with, and that's the topic of trust. I'll give you a worksheet in a minute, and it's folded for a reason because I'd like to invite you not to open up the worksheet. And down this left-hand column is a space for you to jot first names or initials of people that fit that category of people you trust. Think about who are the people that you would say you trust, and as much as possible, don't put family members. By looking around, most of you have your first column filled out. So let's move to part 2 of the activity. So if you open up the worksheet, you'll see across the top is a variety of diversity dimensions. So what I'd like to invite you to do is just go through the names of that first column and code them by their diversity. So if they're a male, put an M in gender. If they're a female, put F. And you'll get the hang of just coming up with your own code. And notice what you notice as you go through the process. I want to give you a, I don't know if you'd call it a model. It's kind of a way that we'd like you to think about this phenomenon of how people work their way into your trusted 10. So just kind of think of level 1 trust is folks that you are just getting to know or that you're acquainted with. This is always the biggest number of people we know. It's people we're familiar with. So over time, folks wind their way at work across, and it's a gradation, it's almost degrees, into this second level. If we use time and relationship building, then people move into, my really bad acronym is COMFY. And that's come over to my front yard. And that list of people, I would say, have moved beyond I know their name to they're people that I would trust in my yard, in my house and in my yard. Usually about 10% of this outer circle that we actually feel comfortable with. So the trust is growing there. Those people we trust more. And then we move into that, inner sanctum that we'll call trust. Maybe it's the trusted 10, maybe it's the trusted 20. This is the most diverse group of people in my life. For you too, right? This is it kind of thins out a little bit there. And then we move into our trusted 10. And for most of us, we see the least amount of diversity in that circle. When I have a chance to give somebody, I'll call it a sexy assignment. It's a high visibility project, access to senior leaders. Really, it's maybe a stretch assignment. Am I going to go to the people on my team at this level? Most people would say that they're going to be moving up into this zone or probably into this zone. And so the implication for us as an organization, right, is if we keep giving the good opportunities, promotions, stretch assignments to folks that are up in this zone, then what's going to probably happen with diversity on your team? We're going to keep replicating people that see the world more like we do. When you go back to your team, when you go back to being an amazing leader, what are some conscious things that you might do over the next weeks or days to take what you learned about the like me bias and put it into practice? The more we're able to talk about the like me bias and how it might be influencing our decision making, the more we take this from the unconscious to the conscious.
So in-groups and out-groups is also known as infinity bias. And as I said earlier, we all have a natural tendency towards people who are like us, and so to some people over others. Psychologists have shown that our brains have developed to rapidly classify people as either friend or foe, so to put them into in-groups and out-groups. And so membership of our in-groups and out-groups is based on many factors, which may change over the course of our lives and vary depending on where we are, who we're with, and what we're doing. So the factors which influence who we have an in-group relationship with might include physical characteristics, so age, gender, race, shared interests and hobbies, so potentially sport, music, gardening, or even sort of shared work interests, so the type of science field that you work in, chemistry, biology, inorganic chemistry. Similar lifestyle, so whether or not you have children or caring responsibilities. Coming from a similar background, so being from the same place, having a similar family background, having worked or studied at the same place. Conversely, these factors may also influence who is in our outgroup. Often the factors of influence for our outgroups are constructed around difference, but this isn't always the case. For example, if your experience of being from a particular place has been negative, then you may well place others from that same place into your outgroup. So our in-groups are people that we feel safe with and towards whom we have unconsciously warm feelings. And our outgroups are people towards whom we feel less safe and who we can be distrustful and even dismissive or disdainful towards. We're likely to describe our in-groups with positive characteristics, while we'll see our out-groups with negative characteristics. We're also more likely to see our out-groups as homogenous. So men tend to do something, women tend to do something, accountants tend to be like this, chemists tend to be like that, biologists are like this. And also in-groups will usually be seen as deserving of their success, but not of their failures. And it's vice versa for our outgroups. So some of you may have heard of the implicit association test. And this is a method that you can use to discover who is in your in-groups and who's in your out-group. And it can also help sort of show what your biases are. So these are actual results from the Harvard implicit association test. And there's a link to this test in another slide later on. And this slide shows the power of socially accepted norms and stereotypes in influencing expectations of how the world will be. As you can see from the slide, 75% of men have a strong women-home association, and men-work association, and 80% of women have it. There are a few tests that you can do in your own time. They only last around 5 minutes, and the results of them may surprise you. So the next area that we can use to help us manage and mitigate bias is to increase awareness by being more mindful of our responses. This isn't about being hard on ourselves. None of us have asked to have these biased associations laid down in our unconscious, but we do have a bias control mechanism. But in order for that to operate, we have to notice the mismatch between our behaviour and our values. Being mindful is about noticing in a way that is non-judgmental about ourselves and taking clues from our emotions and reactions that bias may be affecting us. So the first step towards managing our unconscious biases is to accept that they exist and to be actively curious about what they are. So I spoke already about the implicit association test, and this is a great tool for identifying bias. Another tool is keeping an encounter diary. And so here you can keep a comprehensive record of every encounter you have with another person over a period of time. And you can jot down what you notice about that person initially, how you react towards them, and how positive or negative you feel. At the end of this given period, review the diary and reflect on any indications of bias. Another tool that can support understanding of bias is to become more aware of the stereotypes that have strong influences on us. And so Googling things can actually be a good way of identifying the common associations that we experience in the world. And so I actually did some Googling back in July for this training for the Australian assessors for Athena's 1. And so first we Googled senior manager. And so here you can see, even within Google Images, there's not a particularly diverse range of people that they would consider to be a senior manager. And then we also looked at researcher as well. It's slightly more diverse in the people in there, but less diverse in the fact that to Google, obviously, a researcher almost entirely seems to be in a white coat. So carrying on with awareness, and now moving on to looking at being a bystander. So a bystander is a person who observes a conflict or unacceptable behaviour. It might not be something major, it might actually be something minor, but the bystander knows that the behaviour is destructive or likely to make a bad situation worse. An active bystander takes steps that can make a difference. This ranges from not laughing at an inappropriate joke to actively challenging or intervening to stop discriminatory behaviour. It takes commitment, judgment, and skill to be an effective bystander, and so consider the sort of situations which might arise in a meeting and how you would react and what you would be comfortable doing. Be aware of when you are happy to challenge and what might prevent you from doing so. And think about practicing techniques for effective intervention. What you don't want to do is call someone out in a confrontational way, because that in itself could shut down the conversation and could lead to making a bad situation even worse. Studies have shown a reduction in the unconscious biases of people who make a conscious commitment to become active bystanders. So we're now going to look at micro behaviours and micro inequities. So micro inequities are apparently small events which are often hard to prove and covert. They're often unintentional and are frequently unrecognised by the perpetrator, but they occur when people are perceived to be different. And so micro inequities are small behaviours. They may not be picked up as discriminatory or even consciously by the person on the receiving end. But their long-term effect can corrode confidence and self-esteem, and then in turn may lead to defensive or even aggressive behaviour. And so whilst I was out in Australia for the Academy of Science delivering the first round of this training for the sectional committees, there was a story in one of the big newspapers back in the UK involving a Nish Kumar. And this is the sort of real life version of the sort of jovial clip that I just showed you. And so this is slightly sort of related to what's going on politically over here in the UK around something called Brexit. But it's to do with how people seem to be consciously or unconsciously getting his name wrong and calling him Nish Patel. And that actually it's turned out that even companies that he's now employing are calling him Nish Patel. And so the story sort of goes that he's obviously had a reaction to this, and that actually he's now realizing that he's not just getting angry at random, and that it's all these sort of small micro inequities sort of building up to make him react like that. And especially when he's expected, or society is expected, to learn the difference between the various different Chris's who are all white, yet for him, no one, even people he's employing, will get his name correct. And actually, there's the site there, so you can read the whole story. But there was quite a lot that week generally about unconscious bias in the UK. And if you've got the time, it might be worth looking at the articles that were published. So moving on to look at how micro behaviours may affect a committee meeting. And so these are personally things that I have seen or experienced during peer review processes and committee meetings. Prior to working at the Equality Challenge Unit, I also worked at the University of Cambridge in the UK and also the Royal Society of Chemistry. So I've got a background of sitting in many different committee meetings. And so things like checking emails or texting during a face-to-face conversation, consistently mispronouncing a person's name or interrupting a person mid-sentence, passing over someone's opinions or making eye contact only with men whilst talking to a group that contains men and women, taking more questions from men than women, and confusing a person of a certain ethnicity with another person of the same ethnicity. And so we demonstrate micro behaviours, particularly with our in-groups and out-groups, and through each individual instance, and though each individual instance is small, the cumulative effect can be to exclude, devalue, and cause severe distress. And so some of the things that we can do to manage our micro behaviours are to be mindful of body language and non-verbal communication, Nodding can show that you're listening. It doesn't necessarily mean you agree. Smiling can indicate that you're interested and taking someone seriously. Make sure you remember people's names and something about them. And actually for me, remembering there's something about them helps me to remember their name. And if for whatever reason you overlook or ignore someone and become aware of this later on, be prepared to apologise. If you're in a meeting or a committee situation, especially if you're chairing that meeting, you could ask the other participants in the committee or the meeting for feedback on the way that you interacted with people. And this will help you work on developing an inclusive style that feels natural to you. So the small negative micro behaviours can create a corrosive panel environment or committee environment. Then small positive behaviours can achieve the opposite. So for me, just saying hello to people before any kind of meeting can have a real impact on how I experience the meeting. And so micro affirmations, also known as doing warmth, are subtle and apparently small acknowledgements of a person's value and accomplishments. And they may take the shape of public recognition of the person. So just saying good point, referring positively to the work of a person, or commending someone on the spot. So we're now going to move on to bias blind spots, also known as confirmation bias. So confirmation bias affects the way that we receive and remember information. We have a natural tendency to be selective in the evidence we listen to and the evidence we disregard. And we do this through the way we search for information, interpret information, and remember or recall information. We prefer information which confirms what we know and believe, and we're more likely to overlook information which challenges or contradicts. So confirmation bias, in a nutshell, works this way. I meet someone and unconsciously categorize or judge them. Stereotypes and societal norms linked to those categories are linked to that individual. I'm therefore more likely to notice and remember their behaviour, which is in keeping with the categories into which I've placed them, thereby reinforcing my opinion of them in that category and proving myself to be correct. I am less likely to notice and remember their behaviour which does not fit in with that category. And so this is an example from the US. The subjects were senior lawyers who supervised the work of junior lawyers. And the role of junior lawyers is to draft briefs that are then checked by the senior lawyers before they are sent to the client. In this experiment, the researchers wrote a brief and built in a number of intentional mistakes. When the senior lawyers thought the brief had been written by a white person, they noticed far fewer mistakes than when the senior lawyers thought the brief had been written by a black person. And you can notice how the positive and negative comments arise depending on the number of mistakes. And so this image here, sort of basically in a diagram, shows what the previous video was showing. And it's that at any one time, our brain is receiving up to 11 million pieces of information, but it's only got the ability to absorb 40 to 50 pieces of information, which is why training our brains to recognize bias is so important. So just to recap, unconscious bias will mean that you could act more warmly to members of your in-group, pay more attention to people you expect to be in authority. You could overlook the views and opinions of people who are in your out-groups. You might potentially feel anxious about appointing, promoting, or delegating to outgroups. You're more likely to recruit and promote in your own image, and you're more likely to find it easier to strike up a conversation and build rapport with in-group members. And so finally, on to accountability and what you can do about it. So it's important to reflect, analyse and monitor trends to see who is benefiting. And I know that the Academy has been doing this with its equality and diversity reporting around fellowships. It's important to make senior staff and academics accountable for diversity progression. And one way of doing that is putting together policies and processes that will help mitigate the impact of bias wherever possible. But what you must do then is be diligent about the use of the processes and policies that are put in place to mitigate impact of bias. And so regularly reflecting and evaluating on these policies and processes is really important. Create a safe space to discuss bias. And so before committee meetings, you could agree and use ground rules about how you're going to challenge bias. Bias is always easier to discuss if you use personal examples, and commit yourself to addressing challenging situations, but ensuring that you do them in a meaningful and non-confrontational way, taking the time before any committee meetings or any situations that may be challenging, taking the time to think about how you can challenge in a constructive way. So think about what you're going to do about your own unconscious bias. And here is the link to the Harvard implicit tool that I showed you the results for earlier. Be aware of unconscious bias throughout, throughout life, but throughout the committee processes. And so think about unconscious bias in your assessment of individuals when listening to the committee discussions, in your treatment of other committee members, in your assessment of fellowship applications, and also think about being an active bystander if you do see any examples of unconscious bias come up. So here are some examples of bias that might be used in a committee meeting. These are all examples from the UK. These are things that I've heard in the panel discussions for the Athena-Swan applications in the UK, but also for applications for various awards from the Royal Society of Chemistry. Some of these may not be relevant, some of them may be relevant. I just thought they might give you something to think about. So something you may hear is that I'd expect stronger publications from someone from a group of 8 institution. Are these really the strongest publications this person can provide? Their publications haven't been as strong since their career break. I would have thought that they would have used such and such as a referee, or I'm surprised they used that person as a referee. This is a weaker field of science than the other candidates, or you get a sense that they're not being fully honest in this application. And so some of these may come up, and it could be the opportunity to discuss what constitutes a strong publication, whether getting publications in Nature and Science for this particular field of science is necessarily the best place to publish the particular paper, things like that. And so finally, just for a sort of recap of what's been discussed in this session. So confirmation bias This means that you'll only recognise the evidence that confirms your original impression or expectation. The halo effect, this means that once an entity or a person is rated as good in one aspect, all other aspects are seen as good. There's an opposite effect to this called horns, and this is where if one aspect of a person is seen as poor, then all other aspects are likely to be evaluated as poor. When we identify with a person, we're more likely to attribute their success to ability and effort, and failures to bad luck or factors outside their control. And so this is attribution bias. The opposite is the case for people we do not identify with. Their successes are due to external factors and their failures due to their lack of ability. Comparison bias can happen when we compare people or applications to each other. And this is when you're not supposed to be doing that, rather than if it's in the criteria for the sectional committees. And then the final bias is around groupthink. And I appreciate for the sectional committees that there is an element of the discussion where the lead is trying to persuade the rest of the committee to back their applicants. But groupthink is where a vocal or influential committee member expresses their views unequivocally, and then other members' opinions will often align themselves with this view. And this can be particularly the case if committee members are new or inexperienced and may potentially be unsure about their opinion. And so this concludes the unconscious bias training session for today. Thank you. And if you've got any questions, please email the fellowship who'll pass the questions on to me. Thank you.